Today we're going to talk about the referral process for students who you may think might have one of the 13 disability categories. And so this video is going to go through that referral process and also the professionals in special education. So let's first outline the professionals in special education. Often they will be referred to as a multidisciplinary team or an MDT. They could also just be a part of the individualized education plan, IEP team. You hear both in different districts. But these are all the professionals who can give insight about the student, who work with the student pretty routinely, who can give assessment data and give knowledge about the student. And remember, special education can include academics, behavior, it can include job skills. So this is a holistic team, meaning we want to know about the child as a whole and not just the deficits in this one area, for example. So our team, regardless of what we call it, consists of our gen ed teachers. These people are really important because most of our students with disabilities spend the majority of their time in gen ed classrooms. So we obviously want their input, and they were going to have lots of information if they're with these children all day long. It might include the special education teachers. Those teachers are going to help facilitate these meetings, but they also can provide information about specific strategies and interventions that might work for specific disabilities. They are kind of our intervention specialists. They might be our resource teachers. They might be our self-contained teachers. Maybe they just need kind of a coaching support or a consult, meaning that they just need to go visit, the special ed teacher maybe, once a day for 15 minutes just to help get organized. Those kinds of services vary, but that input is so important. Our school psychologists, I often just call them school psychs, are the people, the professionals who assess our students using those diagnostic measures like standardized assessments. So often there will be assessments related to IQ or intelligence. There might be assessments related to adaptive behavior for students with a possible intellectual disability, for example. If you're assessing for an emotional behavior disorder, certainly assessments related to behavior and social emotional learning will be included. If you have deficits in writing, you might take a norm referenced assessment called the test of written language. So it really is depending on what information is needed. Oftentimes it's a holistic approach with the IQ, but then you're going to have supplementary assessments that the school psych can provide and give and administer to those students for some actual evaluation data. And those data are huge because often that's what leads to a diagnosis. So if they score, for instance, a 70 on an IQ test, that perhaps, I'm using perhaps intentionally, may mean they have an intellectual disability because typically students with an ID have about a 70 or below IQ. And so these data help form the whole picture. We don't just want to use one data measure. We want to use lots so that we don't just start making assumptions about a student. Say the IQ score was a 69, which alerts us to a possible intellectual disability, but everything else in the assessment packet says something else. So perhaps we could retest for IQ to see if those data were valid. We want the whole package when it comes to students' assessments. Counselors may be helpful for students who might need social emotional help. Itinerant teachers are our traveling teachers. So often you see those in like preschool special ed. So the population at school A, for example, may only have like 6 preschool students with special needs. So the teacher would start at school A in the mornings and then go to school B in the afternoon to serve those other 5 or 6 children at a different school. Transition specialists and job coaches are really important once a student gets to be in middle school. So any student with an individualized education plan, meaning they have one of the 13 disability categories, will have to have a transition plan by age 16. That's the minimum. Our districts in our state have kind of pushed that back to 15, and some districts have pushed it back to 13 years old. So you'll start having a transition plan, and that is What do you want to do in post-secondary life after high school, and how are we going to give you those skills and knowledge to get there? Your speech language therapists are really important for those students who have speech needs. Social workers might be important. Administrators, they often serve as our local education agency or our LEA. And that person is really kind of the one who signs off on the IEP and the meeting minutes saying, yes, we have these services available at this school or in this setting. Kind of the buck stops with them kind of thing. Your LEA is often your admin, it can be your guidance sometimes. Sometimes the district office personnel will come, especially if it's kind of a interesting case, or if, some small districts, they're just available and able to go to lots of IEP meetings. So, but your LEA is really important, but that typically is an administrator. Your paraprofessionals or your aides or your shadows in your class might be able to provide some information about the students, and of course other specialists. So if the student has physical therapy or PT, occupational therapy or OT, if they have some kind of nursing needs, I had a student who had a catheter, and so certainly that nurse was able to provide us some information. English language learning, hearing specialist, mobility specialist, say the students in a wheelchair, for example. You might also have assistive tech specialist and language interpreters. And of course, parents are going to provide you so much information about the student, and their input is so important, as well as the students. So they know themselves better than anyone else, and they often can tell you. It may not be in simple verbal terms, but in ways that they can communicate, they can often tell you what they need and when they need it. So now let's actually talk about the referral process and how you actually receive special education services. So you see the chart on the screen, and I want to talk to you first about what happens before that chart. So before the referral, that green circle, what's going to be happening is the child's going to probably be in general education classrooms, and that teacher's going to start collecting data. So you're going to notice that maybe the grades aren't the same as the same age peers in the class. Maybe they're lower. Maybe they're lower in only one area, but other areas the student is doing fine or even better. You're going to start having those kind of trend data to say, hey, I think there might be a problem. Perhaps we should get some support and some services. And so throughout this time, again, before we even get to the chart on the screen, that general education teacher is reaching out to the student number one. What does that student need? How can that student be helped? Reaching out to parents, reaching out to former teachers, maybe other current teachers. Are they also noticing similar things? And then you're trying interventions in your classroom. So maybe this, it could be easy as the student needs to move closer to the board. Or maybe the student needs, 10 minutes of individualized reading instruction in addition to the whole group instruction. You're trying out all of those different kinds of interventions, and you're collecting data throughout, because what you want to show, hopefully, is that with these interventions in the classroom, that the student's starting to make progress and show growth, and that will prevent from coming to a referral, right? If the interventions are not working, the student's still not showing the growth that is needed at that interval and that grade level, then you probably start bringing in the special education teachers, you probably start bringing in administration and school psychs, and you're going to kind of present those data to these people to start having conversations about whether you should even go down the eligibility route. If it's deemed that yes, there is a discrepancy in the student's ability or the growth being shown, then perhaps a referral is needed. And that would be a referral for special education services. And that's what this diagram is on the screen. So I want to kind of walk you through that to tell you who's kind of involved in what each part consists of. So once the team, it's a team decision. It's just not one general ed teacher or one sped teacher or one parent. It's a team decision. Decides, yes, we want to go through with the referral route. The first thing that would have to happen is parent consent. Parent consent is needed in order to assess the student using those norm-referenced assessments that I talked about in the previous slide in relation to the school psychologist. So in order for us as a district to test the child, we must get parental consent. Then we go to the evaluation phase. And this phase typically takes a good bit of time because the school psych will need to gather information of data already collected before the referral. And that's going to be weeks and weeks of data because you've got to try everything to essentially say, yes, we've tried everything. Maybe the student has a disability. So once you get to the evaluation, you're reviewing all this data. You're probably sending home parent forms, teacher questionnaires, student questionnaires if applicable. You might be collecting behavior data. You might be giving those norm reference assessments like IQ test. This is a whole lot of information gathering to help form an opinion, right? Or help form a decision about whether the student is eligible or not. After the evaluation phase, the team meets to determine eligibility. And our eligibility is derived from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which we talked about up in the earlier part of the module. And that act, which is actually a law, has given the minimum kind of qualifications for each of the 13 disability categories. So the eligibility criteria for all 13 disability categories. And then our states have said, okay, in addition to this, we're requiring X, Y, and Z. So our state actually has a manual outlining the eligibility for each of the 13 disability categories. And I will link that in our module for you so you can see that. So after our evaluation, our team is determining eligibility based on that packet. So based on those eligibility criteria, does the student have an intellectual disability, a learning disability, a speech language impairment? And the criteria are very clear. You have to meet like 3 out of the 5, for instance, or you have to meet all of the following. And please peruse that document because this will make more sense if you can look at it. Let's say that the student is not deemed eligible. The student does not meet the criteria for any of the 13 disability categories. We're not moving forward with an individualized education plan. That student still may be eligible for a 504 plan. And I've linked that article describing the differences between IDA and 504. Please read that because it really clearly gives the differences of if you're not eligible for a disability, you still might be able to get services and get support. And obviously, if the student doesn't qualify for either, we should be good people and do what the student needs anyway, right? But hopefully, if the student needs support, we can identify them in some way. Let's go back to eligibility and say, yes, the student was eligible. Let's say for a learning disability in math, for instance. Then the team would start drafting the individualized education plan, and you're using all of those data to make decisions. So in the individualized education plan, you're going to talk about the present levels of performance using all of those data. You're going to write year-long goals for the student. So if it's an LD in math, you're probably going to have a lot of math goals. You're going to identify accommodations and modifications the student needs, and you're also going to identify the least restrictive environment. So does that student who's been in gen ed this whole time need some resource? Maybe need some self-contained if they're not working on grade level. I taught K to 5 self-contained, and I had a couple students who were in gen ed who would just come to me for one subject because a 5th grader, for instance, came to me for math because he was working on a 1st grade math level. So that's nowhere near 5th grade math standards. So he would just come to self-contained for just like maybe 45 minutes a day because that's what he needs. So he had a gen ed curriculum for everything but math, and he had a modified curriculum for that subject. And so that IEP would help determine all of this. And that IEP, it's important that you note, is a legally binding document. Meaning if you have accommodations of extra time on a test, you must give it. There's no questions asked. So your team would write that, and that's a pretty lengthy document, but we want it to be because it's outlining the supports the student needs and will receive. As I said on the IEP, you'll also determine placement, which is your least restrictive environment or your LRE. And please look at that backwards triangle on the module. It's orange. And look at the different least restrictive environment options, and you're going to make a decision. Now, it's important to note that an IEP can be amended at any time. You can amend it 1,000 times a year if you'd like. So just because you pick this placement the first time doesn't mean that that's going to automatically work. You're going to try it for a while and continue to collect data on all of these supports, including the placement, but you can always amend it at a later date. And then you're actually, for instruction, I like the word implementation. Let's implement the IEP. Does it work? You're going to continue to collect those data, like I said. You're going to make some instructional based decisions of, hey, this seems to be working. He's making some growth, or man, we might need to add something else or add more time to resource or whatever it might be. And then your annual review is every year you have to meet as an IEP team or a multidisciplinary team, and you're going to review the old IEP and then write the new one for the upcoming year. That happens a minimum of once. So again, you can amend it however many times, but you have to meet at least once a year. And then there's a separate section that's not on this diagram called a reevaluation. And that happens every 3 years. And the point of that is to determine if the student's still eligible for special ed. So an annual review reviews and continues the IEP. A reevaluation says, hey, is this kid even eligible anymore for special ed? Some of our students with LD, for example, might actually be remediated, and perhaps, in a couple years after getting services, won't need special education or is not eligible under the criteria outlined by IDEA in South Carolina.